Hello, everyone. I'm Theo Eshart from Henry Stewart Events, and I'm delighted to welcome you to today's webinar sponsored by Brainrider, From Creativity to Corporate Leadership. During the session, please send through your questions at any point using the questions box, which you can open by clicking on the question mark at the top of your GoToWebinar window. Also, a reminder that a recording of this session will be sent to you tomorrow, so you can view it again at your own pace. And now it's my great pleasure to pass you over to Scott Armstrong, CEO and partner at Brainrider. Thank you, and over to you.
Thanks, Theo, and a big thanks to Henry Stewart. We love connecting with marketers and creative leaders and creative professionals, and so Henry Stewart really gives a great platform for that. I'm Scott from Brainrider. Brainrider is an agency experienced in helping smart marketers get all the execution they need to succeed, using our global studio network to deliver quality turnaround time, quality execution, and budget efficiency. And because we're in that space, we're talking to creative operations and creative leadership and marketing leadership all of the time about some of the challenges that they're facing and ways to optimize what they're doing and how they're running their organization and how they're delivering to create value in their organization and make their team successful and really collaborate and generate success all the way around. I'm pleased to have with me today two awesome and knowledgeable client side guests. I have Timmy from 1888, right? I don't even know how to say that, Timmy, so I'm going to let you introduce yourself. Mills, 1888 Mills, and Leonardo from Simple Practice. And we're going to be in a bit of a discussion, and we want all of you in the webinar part of our discussion. So I know Theo said that you can do questions. I'm going to say I would really like you questions for everybody. So don't hesitate at any point to raise some of the challenges that you're facing or the reasons that you came to the webinar today. And really today's discussion is about crossing the boundary when corporate responsibilities are added to your existing responsibility as an awesome marketer and as an awesome creative person. And the issues become more complex and resolving them becomes more collaborative and the responsibility is greater. So we feel all of that. And most of us weren't trained for that. But the great news is that there's lots of lessons to be learned so that you can make the opportunities even bigger. It's really about project prioritization, managing complex budgeting processes, and exercising creativity within the constraints of corporate objectives, aligned to corporate objectives, but also having your full team, your corporate culture understand the awesome work that you do. Let me start with a poll, and then I'm going to let Timmy and Leonardo introduce themselves. But we'd like you to introduce yourselves first. So I think we can put a poll question up for everybody. Let's see if this the magic of GoToMeeting works for us or GoToWebinar works for us. Oh, something is happening. You know what? While we're waiting for the poll to come up, Timmy, why don't you tell us your story?
All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Timmy Magic. I work for 1888 Mills out in Griffin, Georgia, down south. Um, I have a background in advertising and graphic design. So I started out as a young graphic designer at some point and worked at a few agencies across Maryland, Ohio, Maryland, and then Atlanta. And eventually I found myself on the client side. As I said, I work for 1888 Mills. I lead visual merchandising and marketing over there. And 1888 Mills is a textile company. We manufacture, and produce home textiles. So you're talking about your towels, bedding, comforters, all that kind of stuff. And I do lead a small team, which is something that I do take some pride in. We're a small but mighty team. 1888 is a global company, so everything we do as a small team touches a lot of points, and we do have some pretty huge customers that we service. So we're a small but mighty team. That's it.
Amazing. And I saw Timmy speak earlier, or I guess it was late last year, and it was really amazing to hear from her experience. I've spoken with and heard Leonardo quite often. So, Leonardo, why don't you go ahead and tell people who you are, what you do, where you're from?
Sure, Scott. Thanks. Hey, everyone. My name is Leonardo de la Rocha. I use the pronouns he and him. Based out here in California, Silicon Valley. I've been here for close to 12 years now and worked mostly on the client side my entire career. Large companies like Yahoo, Facebook, Intuit, and Spotify. But I've also led some of the creative teams at these various companies, most notably for Facebook business products. I was on the product design side, but also then switched and supported the business marketing side for the products. So got a good taste of leading creative teams in the agency style of what we were doing there. And really excited to be here and answer any questions you all have.
Amazing. Thanks both. What you've got great backgrounds to share, and again, some of the questions that are coming from the audience. So, in the poll, I think you probably can all see it. The third of you want to learn a little bit more about maintaining creative quality under constraints. And then it looks like there's a tie between allocating team resources and balancing hands-on work with team management, followed by justifying your work to leadership. And my guess is that all of those are issues for you, but we'll focus a little bit on the priorities. Let's talk a little bit about the business value of creative work because that anchors a lot of those four challenges. What are some of the key tactics you've used to build influence with executive leadership while you're advocating for creative work? Leonardo, do you want to start us off a little bit?
And I think the first thing that comes to mind is how unrealistic it is to expect the C-suite that that support you, or even all of my executive partners to get design, to understand the value. So I think it's on me. It's always been on me. It's on us leaders to show how design actually gets results. And I tend to tie creative decisions to outcomes that matter to them:
Mm,
conversion, retention, efficiency gains. And I position our team not as a service org, it's very dangerous to do, but as a strategic enabler that accelerates business bets. And one specific helpful tactic that I've used for years, I think it's been useful for me, it may be useful for y'all, is to pivot designer or creative speak to something that sounds like more outcome language, giving your creatives, the people that you lead, a very different business lexicon that can work wonders. And an example is, we might say in our creative agency, it just looks cleaner. But what you should be saying is it increases comprehension. You might also say, we redesigned the flow, or we redesigned the UX or user journey, when you really should be saying, we remove friction to conversion. And so just allowing your team to understand how to speak differently in that business language can really work wonders in helping leadership and others understand the value of what you do.
that's amazing. Yeah, that's super helpful. And I like the practical examples. Timmy, you're a smaller team. How does it work for you?
I think for us, the biggest thing within the space that we're in, especially with the customers that we serve, we consider our sales team our first customers on our team, and really helping them present what we have to show to our customers. One of the biggest things we work with is trends in the industry. So, an example, say we have a big retailer who we have to present a new collection of textiles to, we're going to them with data and trends that back up the designs that we're presenting. Everything from the packaging to the product itself. Just like, just kind of piggybacking off what Leonardo said, it's really speaking in their language and presenting the creative, making them understand that the return on their investment here is really backed up by the data and the trends that we've researched and seen, and keep putting together good visuals to follow it.
Right, you're using the creative muscle, but you're putting it in the business context, and it
Yeah.
sounds like for both of you, it's the real art of listening and understanding how your audience, in this case, C-suite or leadership, are thinking about some of the business challenges that they're focused on, and then tying the work that you and your teams are doing to those challenges using their language instead of our language as creatives. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
Yes,
definitely.
exactly. Yeah. And
And
I'll add real quick, I'll add, I mean, for us at 1888, one of the things that we do when it comes to just company goal setting is all the goals start from the top, start from corporate, and it kind of trickles down. We look at each level when we're setting goals, when we're setting KPIs, all those things kind of funnel into each other. So we're not just creating, in isolation, we're really looking corporate goals and making sure that what we're doing aligns with that.
one of the for the audience, one of the things that Timmy Leonardo and I and the team have been working on is really a practical playbook to circulate to everybody at the end of this discussion, because we've actually been talking for weeks about this stuff. So if it sounds like we're super polished, everybody's super smart on this call, but we've also been working hard to try to be valuable. And so in that, I've got a few different um, examples of those tools. And I think, this one might fit really quite well, right? Which is trying to understand the different levels within the organization and then the different strategic questions they're facing, so that you can really connect on the language that you're using to the audience that you have. Your CEO, CFO, CRO language is still going to be different than director or manager or sales rep language, and it's certainly different from your creative teams. We'd love some feedback or questions around these slides, so I'm watching that question panel really closely, and I'd love to hear from you. I think we all understand it's a little bit about matching language and understanding the strategic vision, and then translating that design or copy or web or campaign executional back into that language. What are some of the questions that you're facing out there in the audience? I'll leave that open. Go find that question panel and we'll submit it. And in the meantime, I'm going to move on to a second question that's really tightly related to this one. We're not going to get very far away from connecting to corporate objectives and understanding business objectives in the context of the work that you're doing. And that's really the question, another big priority question that came up in the poll, which is project prioritization. So you're doing a good job of communicating what the work is to your audience based on their language. Doesn't often matter, right? They all corporate priorities change, market conditions change, leadership priorities change. How are you working through prioritization with your teams, first of all? And then how are you shifting those priorities as things change? Timmy, you did a great job at that last one. Why don't we start with you and then we'll move back to Leonardo?
Okay, so what we've done on our team is we've kind of adopted a really lightweight version of the RISE prioritization um, strategy. And basically, what we do is we kind of just look at we really analyze what's on the table. We know who our big ticket customers are, understanding what those deliverables are for them, and making just really looking at the big picture and making sure that we're servicing those and looking at the resources that we have, allocating those resources based on what they need. And then we go back and look at everything else and then start from the back and kind of go one after the other. Like I mentioned earlier, we're a small team, so it really does get tough. And that's when we kind of tap out into outside resources. And then we refocus what we put into that big priority customer understand the level of work that we can outsource, where we want to focus the top talent to, and we just move things around based on that. And just going in, but also looking at the stakeholders and understanding what do we need to, what are the questions that these stakeholders would have concerning this particular issue, and how do we respond to that, and making sure that we're looking at what we're delivering to everyone outside of the customer, from accounting to the sales team to even within ourselves, just looking at what everyone is answerable for and making sure that we're able to deliver to them directly, and also just making sure that the value is top of mind, making sure that what we're delivering is of value to them.
Amazing. You talked to you talk about being a small team, but you're actually, I think, leading in some of the processes that you're using and implementing them across a small team. So it's really great, a great example. Do you want to go in a little bit more detail? You mentioned rice at the top of your comment. Just for people who aren't as familiar with it, can you go into a little bit more detail about how you use the rice prioritization matrix and how it's helpful?
So for us, like I said, we look at our big ticket customers. We know who they're reaching, first of all. We know where the money is. We know what we need to deliver for them. And then we look at the impact that we're going to make with what we need to deliver. And then we kind of just prioritize what creative we need to put, we prioritize what order we need to put that creative in when it comes to delivering, and then making sure that we are um, certain in what we're delivering, and then understand the overall context and overall effort that we're putting into the deliverables, the time, the money, the um, the emotions that are also going into. I think it takes a lot of things. So just kind of putting all of that together, and then when once we look at all of that, we know who our top customer is. We know they're the money makers. We focus on them, and then for everyone else, that's where we're really able to kind of break down how we're prioritizing. This person needs this. This person needs this. We're able to move those resources from, the buckets around for everyone.
You're a creative team that's using a structured process to come up with a number that's helping you prioritize. Are you communicating that number only to your team, or do you use the rice outputs with the broader stakeholders? Is leadership aware? How are you using the tool?
We do use it with pretty much everyone.
Mhm.
An example, we do get on a call every week where everyone pretty much gives an idea of what the priorities are. So this is where we get to say, hey, Leonardo, we have this project of yours on our plate. Unfortunately, here's what we're going to do to make sure that we get you what you need on time, under budget, all these things, but we might have to pivot here and here, and you fall at number two because number one is the moneymaker. So those are the kind of things that those are the things that we do to make sure that everyone gets. And I think part of this is really communication. If being transparent with what's going on with my team, um, also lets everyone understand why we're using this matrix, why we're prioritizing this way. I think communicating and letting the stakeholders know, give them the rationale behind the steps that we're taking. I think that's really important. Just keeping an open, keeping the conversation open, open lines of communication, letting them know why we're doing certain things and why we're ranking certain things a certain way.
A big picture tool that gives you support around the because when people aren't prioritized the way they feel like they should be prioritized internally. So smart. Leonardo, let's move over to you. How are you tackling prioritization?
Yeah, very similar. And I love the RISE framework. I'm glad that we put that together for this playbook. And yeah, Timmy's right. Like, there's so much alignment that you can get from it. But there's a variation of RISE that I often use too. And this is usually at larger companies when you have like a PMM organization or a big data science organization that's kind of solving for the reach. And it's still the ICE, but the additional one is S. Like, so it's ICE plus S. And the S is for strategy. And
Mhm.
the strategy part is, does it align with the company goals? And even at the creative team level, if you're not anchored to the business value, if you're not anchored to that customer, the company strategy, design can sometimes be seen as decoration. So at companies that I've led creative teams, every initiative started with a success metric and ends with a very important learning loop. And that's how we stay relevant in the company, and that's how we keep a seat at the strategy table. So yeah, using Rice is important. Defining what success looks like is important. Selecting whatever proxy metrics you need, like a click-through rate or NPS, or if you're in the UX space, time on task. Reporting the outcomes in dashboards, like Timmy was saying, sharing it all transparently at every level of your team, not just in a month-end deck. And then, like I was mentioning, this retro at the end to close the loop and learn to figure out how you can adjust and make changes for next time. That's all embedded within that ICE plus S method, but
Yeah.
everything plus one to what Timmy said.
Right. We own the creative conversation. We collaborate on the prioritization. And so it's finding the language to do that. And, the I often think of my job as talking to the students that sat in the very front of the class and did the assignment perfectly according to exactly what the professor wanted or teacher wanted, and then connecting that to the kids in the back row who didn't pay much attention to what was going on in class, didn't totally understand the assignment, but did something truly interesting and innovative. And if
Yeah,
they had a cool enough teacher or professor at the front of class, they're like, okay, you didn't really get the assignment, but I really like, what you did here. We're trying to get those two parts of the class to understand each other finally. We left high school long ago, and yet that kind of complicated communication is still in place. And metrics and tools for sure are a way to do that. Let me pop back up here. You know, as simple as sort of understanding what's the project, how much effort will it be, what's going to be output, what do
yeah,
we expect from that, and then to your point on the strategy side, what's the business impact, and then how do you sort of summarize the value that is contributing to the organization, makes the conversation about prioritization so much more concrete for the business class side of the audience,
right. Yeah, well
right?
said.
Because they think what we do is easy, and they're probably never going to not, we don't even necessarily want them to think it isn't brilliant, right? We want them to respect the power of creativity, but realize the amount of effort that goes into it, and really change the conversation from how easy is it to where does it fit within organizational prioritization. And if you want to change that, then you need to make sure that you're aligning your project to business goals more completely, because we, the internal studio or the marketing organization or the creative team, will, you know are also speaking that language with you. Now, the reality is there's always more work than we can get done. And Timmy referenced this a little bit. What, how do you decide when you are giving projects to an internal team, when you're prioritizing projects for that internal team, how you're managing internal team burnout, and more importantly, how are you leveraging external resourcing, which is often where we help, to change that mix, make that mix more effective.
Yeah, I can
Leonardo,
jump in. Okay, Scott.
sorry, go ahead. You go
I
ahead.
can jump right in. I remember partnering with Brainrider years and years ago while I was leading the creative team at Facebook, and your team was clutch in helping us move things forward. And that's one of the things that I think is important. Um, I tend to think of in-house work as the things that are brand critical and vendor partner work as velocity based. And that's not always true. So take this with a grain of salt because you need to adjust it depending on what you're working on. Because I can't say I never outsource the thinking part and only execution support scale. Sometimes that flip flops. If there's a gap in my team, I have to outsource the thinking part because I don't have that skill set in my team. So it ebbs and flows and changes, goes up and down depending on the type of work I'm doing. But generally speaking, I kind of think of it as like, what is the core versus the catalyst? The core for me is usually brand, UX work, identity work. I'll try to keep that in house or close to my chest. The catalyst allocation is more of like the campaign work, niche production, or again, nuance, deep thinking that I just don't have the expertise in house to do. And obviously, there's a big overlap, right? And I think you need to be really conscious about what that overlap is so that you're never siloing your third party creative team or vendor team from your internal team. You've got to create rituals and opmex and document sharing so that everyone understands what the overlap is and everyone can divide and conquer based on what they're good at.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting answer. The agency client and now internal agency or internal creative operations mix has really changed in the last, okay, so I've been doing this for 40 years. But in the last decade and even in the last 5 years, internal capability has really improved,
It's
and
true.
you are closer to the brand, you're closer to the customer, and you're closer to the organization. And you've got the strategic chops and the executional chops for sure. So part of the agency role has shifted. Sometimes you're right. You have a capability gap and you sort of need some help in an area that your team doesn't have skills. And so when we're helping guide clients around resourcing mix, internal to external, and even how the external resourcing is delivered, we're really asking, what is the work? How much work is there? Um, what are the capabilities or skills that are going to be needed to do that work? What level of strategic collaboration or insight is needed to do the work? And then finally, how is the work tying to strategic value and objectives for the organization? And if you go back 20 years ago, you would take the most important work and you would send it out to a famous agency.
That's right.
Goodby did all that work for Apple, for example. But today, the answer to those questions more often than not leads the strategic work to the internal team because they know the brand, they've got the proximity, they've got the capability now. The question becomes around capacity.
That's right.
And the same team that you're asking to do strategic, thoughtful brand work that's connected to customer outcomes and creating value to the organization is going to get burned out doing work at scale to post 400 video cut downs into social media from some long form content that you've done. And
That's right.
so looking at those 5 questions, is another strategic framework to say, what can I outsource efficiently and effectively to free up my internal resources to do their best work, and to be able to demonstrate that work against whichever prioritization matrix that I'm doing. Yeah, for sure. Do you have any examples of successes in doing that, Timmy or Leonardo, where you're sort of chunking up the work to different parts of the organization or different vendors?
I have a couple of examples actually. So we do have in-house photo studio, and like I said, we're a small team, so you can imagine, when we have a customer where we have to deliver, PDP photography for 50 SKUs,
Yeah,
and I have a photographer who's, she's churning out photography, but the photography still needs to be edited, and we have so those are the kind of times when, we have to outsource the editing, we have to outsource, creating the final digital assets that have to come through. So that those are the kinds of um, decisions that we make on our end. And even for us, as uh, we're not heavy tech, so we have a lot of manual experiential uh, setups that we have to do in our showrooms, things like that. Even down to styling a bed, those are the kind of things that we outsource. We have internal teams that do that stuff, but at the end of the day, we get to a point in the year where we have to make a strategic decision on how we're going to allocate those resources. Are our internal teams dealing with creating the designs and overseeing the production of the physical assets that we're going to put in the showroom? And we have external teams actually styling and setting up the showroom. So those are the kind of things that those are the kind of decisions that we have to make internally. Back to to creating digital assets, we we're creating social media content, but we know that we don't have the capacity to produce, like you said, we have to do so many shots out of a long form video. That's the kind of stuff we send out, externally. So those are kind of decisions that we make on our team to really be efficient at the end of the day, because we know what our limits are. Now we do push ourselves to, and as we go along, it's also a learning process, because we learn things. There um, there are capabilities that we know we don't have. We learn enough about them so that we are also able to work in tandem with our vendors to make sure that everything is aligned. Like all the work that we're doing is aligned, and we're making sure that we're sticking to our goal of making sure that we're aligned with our corporate goals.
You're such a strategic leader. Both of you are. I love it. You keep escalating the thinking from being reactive to thinking strategically about what's going on. You mentioned a couple of things that were really important there. In working with your vendors, you're trying to find a model to collaborate better, right? So an individual freelancer solves a real quick problem for you, but sometimes if the scale of the project means that putting a collection of freelancers together gets more chaotic and maybe even less efficient. And the efficiency of outsourcing, in classic organizations, the internal studio is just seen as a fixed cost. And so every time you outsource, people ding you with charging more money to do it. But the reality is, clients that, for example, that we work with, they're running through Brainrider because they can execute that work cheaper and faster, sometimes even overnight, than they would be able to do it in house, which makes sense for that volume production where it's easy to collaborate, right? Hand that off outside of your team and have your CFO and C leadership see the total costs of executing the work that they want, and you create a more responsive, flexible, and strategic internal operation for sure. On that subject, we got a question from Cardi Lee, who asked, does anyone ever argue over their rice scores and demand to be higher priority?
I can answer that question. Yes, it happens all the time. I think in any organization, I think that's normal. I think you will find, you know, everyone feels they should be prioritized. But the reality is that's why we have these conversations. That's why we leave the communication lines open, and that's why we let everyone know. We make sure everyone is aware of what our number one, what our capabilities are, and set the expectations for
Right.
what they're requesting. If someone requests something and they expect to be prioritized, the reality is your project is actually going to take 2 weeks. It's not going to be done in any shorter time.
Yep.
So I can outsource your project. It's going to be done in 2 weeks, but the in-house team has to focus on this particular project because we know that the ROI on this one, sorry, it surpasses yours. So at this point, you know, build up your business unit and we can make you the priority next time. So we just kind of keep those lines open and make sure everyone is aware of what's going on. And like I said, if we know we don't have the capability in-house, letting them know, hey, your project is going to be done by a third party. This is why, this is how long it's going to take, and we'll make sure that, we'll make sure it's done right and it's done on time and it's done properly.
We've been running amazing. We've been running, and you're right. Like the answer is, it happens all the time for all of us. So, Cardi, don't feel alone with your question. We're all fighting that battle. We've been running some workshops, which have been really successful, allowing people to sort of, and we're trying to do workshopy version even today. Allow people to bring the real situations of their real corporate culture and leadership structure and priorities into a session to figure it out. And two ideas that really popped up that are pretty useful. The first is that on prioritization questions when dealing with your stakeholders, what you always want to do is answer with a yes and. And you just did that in your answer to me. You said, yes, you have priorities, and to get them higher in the rice matrix, here's how we're going to need to frame them up. And you're going to need to collaborate, not with me. I'm not the person saying no. I'm saying, yes, I'm doing everything that's at the top of the priority list in order. You need to work with your stakeholders to balance the corporate priorities, not the creative execution priorities. The second is that even the best of organizations are only really able to plan out 70% of their work.
Yep.
That there's always at least a 30% fire drill. And in your organization, it might even be higher than 30% fire drill. But when you're thinking about your resources and when you're communicating to leadership at the start of the year, instead of pretending that we can get our stakeholders to do better this year, write better briefs this year, plan further ahead this year. It never happens. The reality is to say we can do better work when it's got a great brief and it's planned ahead and it's strategic. But we're going to reserve a certain amount of our capacity for last minute requests. And they can go through a completely separate prioritization matrix around that 30% of remaining rush time. And we have also aligned partners or outside vendors, you mentioned that, Timmy, that can take any requests that exceed that 30% so that we can still get them done. But we're going to need some incremental budget to get that to happen because we're already aligned against the overall corporate priorities. And to do that, I think we got one more fun little slide, right? Which is you kind of need to understand the stakeholders that you're dealing with, where they fit within the organization, the power that they've got, the way that they collaborate, what their specific goals are, and how they connect to the overall corporate goals. And if you can be smart about how you're saying yes and smart about how you're managing your 30% of emergency work, then you become that strategic partner that Leonardo talked about at the very start, where people see you not as a service bureau, but really as people doing important work. Definitely, why don't we put up another poll? And I'm also got Paulie has asked, okay, we got questions coming in now. That's exciting because I really wanted to make this sort of workshop style. Um, it it says it's slightly off my screen here. Let me just see if I can pop it out. You had mentioned that internal creative operations have changed a lot in the last 10 years. Can you elaborate? Oh, great question. Why don't I bounce it to you two first, and then I made the comment, so then I will pick up after we get your experience with it. And there's a
Yeah.
poll.
Well, I can jump in just to keep the ball rolling with that question. I think the biggest changes that I've seen and I've experienced firsthand is that in-house you can't staff for everything. You're very much constrained with resources. So even if you have an in-house creative team, you can't build out a team that does it all. And so thinking about that macroeconomic constraints in a company like Simple Practice where I work today, we wish we could do everything in-house. We don't have the budget for it. We don't have the butts and seats to do that kind of work. And that's very different. I feel like when I worked at larger tech companies, you have the budget and resources to do kind of whatever you wanted to do. So that's one of the biggest factors that I think has adjusted the way that you approach problem solving. And again, like when I joined Simple Practice, we had a very strong brand team, a really good marketing team, but we didn't have that really strong muscle to do our brand identity work. we hired Kodo for that, and they did an amazing job partnering with us. Eventually, we did hire that person, a lovely creative director who came to us from Apple, and she could have done the work, but we had her later, and we had to use Kodo when we didn't have her. So I think just paying attention to what your constraints are and knowing that those constraints are now more evident and more pronounced than ever is what the biggest difference for me has been.
Yeah, that's a great answer for sure. Timmy, how about your experience?
Same thing. It really is just understanding what the team's capabilities are over time. What I've seen, and just a little bit more on my background, I've worked for really small companies where I alone was the creative team and product development. So, and when you're in a silo doing things like that, that was where I really learned how to reach out for resources and understand what the limitations were. And as I, as I started leading, teams and seeing the issues that I faced as a one man band, seeing it even on a bigger scale in individuals that knew what their limits are, even though they were willing to push themselves to do the work and learn the work. The reality is there are certain things that have to be given to the people that know how to do it, because if you want good work, you have to get good people who are going to do the work well. So um, over time, I think that's something that a lot of people are coming to terms with, is really understanding that you do have to source um, the right talent, and if it means reaching outside of your organization to do that, at the end of the day, I think that's part of that conversation of, you know, communicating with the stakeholders and letting them understand, you know, the benefits and the end result of pulling
Mm,
those resources in.
we keep coming back to that point. Yeah, I think you both made amazing points, and they really tie into the fact that internal agencies and internal creative work and internal teams are doing more and more sophisticated work that impact business results and business effectiveness. And we're doing it with much more sophistication. So we moved from there used to be a project manager to then there was a creative operations manager, and now there's creative operations and creative leadership that are actually get speaking the same strategic language, which is what you both keep saying over and over again, with the rest of the leadership team. Because it was 30 years ago that McKinsey came out and said we really need to be valuing the brand as a concrete asset in what's happening within the organization, and the development of the brand, the protection of the brand, the maintenance of the brand all comes out through the communications that we do, which is really effective through amazing work. And so the connection to that work has moved much more internally instead of getting a third party at the strategic end or at the brand end. It's really the organization that is living and breathing, delivering that brand messaging and communication and alignment. There's still a lot of work to get done that used to be done by internal creative resources in any organization that often isn't as strategic, which is why if you take a look at the poll questions that popped up, using data to support creative decisions was the number one issue around translating creative work into business value, and then maintaining creative integrity. And both of those are really saying we need to help support the great work that we're doing within the organization and within the organization leadership. Data has become a huge question within creative operations, within marketing operations, because the rest of the organization often speaks in data. The easiest way to have a conversation with your CFO is to talk about the overall corporate objectives and be able to tie it to some numbers. And in the Rice Matrix or any other prioritization matrix, Timmy, you did an amazing job within your organization of turning creative discussions into numbers. And even the amount of work that we're doing and how hard that work has been to do we can turn into numbers. Let me just flip up here. There's another one. Oh, right, which is understanding the project initiative, how much effort it's going to take, how it aligns to the business objective. If you can start tracking some of that data related to the work that your teams are doing, then you're not having a conversation that says, my team's working too hard and they're burning out, which is easy for anyone else in the organization to say, my team is working very hard and they're burning out too. You're actually able to have a data-driven organization that says, my team is doing this much work against these business priorities, generating this impact, and this is where we need to make a new investment, not a new expense, to make that work happen for the organization. And so being able to track your work and then slice and dice it in terms of CEO, CFO, CSO, CRO, all the C-level priorities will really strengthen your ability to communicate that. That's a very, so Polly, thanks for the question. Hopefully, ask another one if we haven't even gotten to the answer that you wanted or are looking for. Really loving those questions coming in. I'm going to move us on to a connected question, which is you both started out, we all started out in some version of a creative role. And you're now in an organizational leadership role, and that's leadership transition that we talked about. What are some of the biggest challenges you personally have faced when you're shifting from becoming an individual contributor to leading a team? How has your mindset evolved? I think we've heard lots of that already anecdotally in the examples you're given, but what does it feel like to become a big shot?
I guess I'll take that first. Um, I think, first of all, I think there's a sense of, obviously, there's a sense of accomplishment. There's a sense of, uh, you know, there's a drive to do better. And I think along with that comes uh, a wider lens of what's actually happening around you. As an individual contributor, you're in your silo. You get your assignments. Your head is down. You do the work. You deliver, and based off of that, and not just off of the work that you're doing, but also you know the other professional elements that come along with that. You go up the ladder. Um, I think for me personally, like I said, there's a sense of accomplishment in that. But as I started leading teams, I knew there was something else that I needed to pay attention to because I was once in their shoes. I think the biggest thing for me, and I know I think I shared this um, with us earlier, was really seeing myself in my team, understanding what their pain points are. And I think as creative leaders, I think one of the most important things is really recalling or remembering what it was like to be in their shoes. There's a lot of empathy that I think
Yeah.
as a creative we do have that, but as we go up the ladder and the corporate side comes in, there begins to be that detachment of the work needs to be done. You're starting to use all the corporate speak, and that the energy of being a creative starts getting lost. I think it's always good to have that reminder that the team is a machine that needs to be kept oiled, and your job as the creative lead is to make sure that you're applying that oil in the right spots. If it doesn't even have to be about the work. Sometimes it's really about the people that are doing the work. If the people that are doing the work are not okay, the work's not going to be good. So
Oh, insight.
yeah, yeah.
Hmm.
For me, as I've grown, I think that transition, that was one of the things that I had to just keep at the top of my mind is these folks are people too. I want us to do great work together, and as I'm leading them, I always have to see myself in them and also really understand what they do, because I think as leaders, everyone has people on their team, I don't have to know everything. I don't have to know how to do everything you do, but I also have to understand enough of it that I can empathize when you come to a roadblock and I can help you navigate getting out of it.
Smart. Yeah. So you're taking that emotional energy that made you amazing at the start of your career and remembering it, and then you're replacing the oil or oiling it or removing the barriers so that they can continue delivering that creativity for the organization. And that empathy supports that, along with all of the smart strategic tools that you've been using to make the thinking and the value concrete for everyone in the organization, including your own team. So smart, Leonardo. Let me pop over to you.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if I can top Timmy's question. You said that so well, but I think at the heart of what you said, I agree with, and that is empathy. But my secret sauce, Scott, has been I have actually never stopped doing the creative work. And that's why I look so old and tired. Because I do spend my off hours and weekends helping teams, helping small businesses, doing creative work. And I feel like that has served me well throughout my career, even getting to the level that I am at, never losing sight of the tools that people are using, the approaches they're taking. I still go to conferences like Config to see what the latest and greatest thing Figma's offering. But doing the work for me has been really, really important to get to what Timmy described as having that empathy. But I think tactically speaking, there has been a big shift. Like I've had to let go in my day job of being the expert. In my
Mm,
personal work, I can be the expert. But in my day job, I have to let go of that. You have to move from being a crafts person to a craft multiplier. And I think there's three things that I can think of that has helped me. First, I'm very controlling. I'm a Taurus, and I just like having control. But that control needs to become trust. And
mhm.
then I'm a doer. I'm a creative. But that doing needs to turn into enabling. And then like Timmy, I lead with a lot of empathy. I lead with a lot of praise. But you can't just praise your team. The oil that you use to make the machine work needs to be influence. So from praise to influence. And I think if you use those three, like control to trust, doing to enabling, praising to influencing, you're going to be a strong leader and you're going to stay connected to the work and what your team is doing.
Super smart. Yaron Park put in a question. More and more over the years, I've seen creative operations, creative and design PM roles become contract and temp roles within
Mm.
organizations and even agencies. What might you attribute this trend to? Let me take a quick stab at that one. And that is, a lot of organizations aren't doing the work that the two of you are doing to
That's right.
connect the strategic value of the creative organization and even the marketing organization to the delivery for the overall business. And so when you don't feel like a strategic player, then you feel like I don't need dedicated resources, or I don't need to invest in FTEs to support this work over time. And I think that also comes down to creative operations, creative direction, marketing direction, not really understanding how to prioritize work with internal teams versus external teams. So if your internal team is doing a lot of straightforward work at scale, it should be outsourced.
That's right.
And the internal team's real advantage is being able to do that emotionally connected, well fueled, still present to the three of your points, strategic work that delivers against organizational objectives because you're tighter to what's happening. And often the budgeting process and then the work triage process, how you determine what work is important and where you put it, and then how you make the budget of how much that work cost transparent to the organization, not just in internal hours, but the total cost of internal resources versus the total cost of external resources, and why it makes sense to send your social media posts externally, Timmy, as an example, versus keeping core brand elements or brand evolution or user interface, Leonardo, which is critical to you. I'm going to pull up one last little slide here because we are running out of time, and that's really asking everybody in the audience to think about how are you triaging the work strategically, using some of the same thinking that we've been talking about all along. How what does tier one work look like in your organization? What does tier two or tier three or whatever label you use? What is the strategic work that's urgent or essential? What is the valuable work that may not be as strategic? And then what is the enabling work that doesn't need nearly as much collaboration with the rest of the organization, but is still necessary to get done?
Yeah.
And how are you defining that tier in your business? What work falls into that tier for which resource? Internal, who internally? Freelancers, agencies, or a company like Brainrider that really supports internal agencies? And then how are we eliminating bottlenecks or gaps in each of these tiers to make sure that the work flows? I think, Yaron, when you're doing that strategic work organizationally, you're demonstrating to the C level why FTE count that understands the business, has social or political capital within the business, and as part of the ongoing budgeting and strategic objective setting process, you become a core function of the company succeeding, as opposed to a PM who's constantly saying, no, we're already doing too many little tiny icons or, very executional work. We don't have the capacity to help with this customer presentation or take these slides to the next level or do this, specific pitch collateral to earn some business or the user interface of the new page or flow, workflow that we're doing. Like all of those elements are super strategic when they're presented right. What's your experience with when to work with external resources, when to work with contractors, when to work with partners, and how do you make that case internally? And then that'll take us almost to the end of this session.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. You go first, Leonardo. So
Okay,
which
sure. You said a lot of great things that I agree with there, but I think the only additive thing that I would say is even if you are an internal a creative ops person, by the way, I think creative and design ops is the most important muscle to have in any organization. But let's say you are in-house, you have to remember that you can't do it all. And one of the mantras that I help teach my ops people is always be putting yourself out of business. Like make sure that you can pass your work on to somebody who can do it more efficiently, effectively, while setting up guardrails that help the business succeed. And so my design ops partner, a woman named Jess, she is really, really good at doing the organization and strategic work in-house, but then contracting somebody with an outside-in perspective that can cut through the BS and help you see how you can get efficiency gains. And I think that's the thing I would add, Scott, is that outside-in perspective is sometimes invaluable to getting your team to work differently and better. Because when you're in the muck, sometimes you can't see the way out, and it does take that outside-in perspective. So keep that in mind as you're thinking about facilitating who to bring in and when to bring them in. When you feel like you're stuck in the muck, it's a really good time to raise your hand and get that support.
we're at the top, I can't believe it. We're at the top of the hour.
You know,
Um,
what fast.
if you're on this call and you want some tools or some outside perspective, or you want to just know that you're not crazy in what's going on, Timmy and Leonardo are real pros within the business, and Brainrider's in the business of helping clients sort through these and optimizing the mix of resourcing that you're doing and delivering that resourcing, cheaper, faster, but with the same level of creative quality that you're expecting, and most importantly, with the trust of a relationship behind it to help you get it all done. So all three of us would be happy to help you. We're actually going to continue working on some of those resources so that we can send them out to you later this week based on the questions and the poll results that came in. I'm really pleased that you were able to do questions in the session, but I provided a little bit of a link down below in case you have feedback. And we'd always love to make these sessions, these webinars, our workshops, anytime we're sharing practical tips, stronger. I'd love it if you had questions, if you wanted to continue to feed them through, because that will help us in developing these resources to be more practical. And I just wanted to give a great big shout out to Henry Stewart for having us, but most importantly, for Timmy and Leonardo for being amazing professionals and brave enough and smart enough, I would argue, to share your experience and the ways that you're cracking, but also to be continually learning. I loved the conversations that we had in preparation for this session, and I've loved seeing both of you share your knowledge and experience. So, a really big thank you on behalf of everybody who attended, on behalf of Brainrider, because you've just been amazing partners through this process. And a big thanks to the audience. Thanks for the comment. Last question wasn't even a question. It said, so helpful to hear everyone's perspective. Thanks so much. So Cardi and Polly and Yaron, thanks for your questions and comments, and everybody else. Let us know if you've got more. Enjoy the rest of your day and go on and be a strategic, awesome, empathetic, empowering, and successful leader in this space. And let me help you do it.
Thanks, Scott. Bye, everyone.
Bye.